I'm going to be talking about highway design in placemaking. I'm a director of Phil Jones Associates, which is a well-known highways and transportation company. We've recently rebranded to PJA, which is a lesser-known firm, but just remember the Phil Jones Associates bit. So as Jonathan says, I'm a panel member. I do a lot of design review work for this panel and a few others, including the Bristol Urban Design Forum. I've probably done 30 reviews in the last 3 years or so, so I've seen development at all scales, good, bad, ugly, large stuff and small stuff as well. I've also worked on some garden towns, so I've worked on Harlow, which is one of the original three, so Taunton, Didcot and Harlow. Some very interesting ideas coming out of Harlow. And also I've worked on some garden villages, so involved in 2 garden villages in the Bristol area at the moment. This is possibly one of my favourite diagrams of all time because what it depicts is 2 ways that a place can be. The place on the left is actually the sort of place that we've built a lot of actually. It's a place which is quite segregated, sort of development is hung off cul-de-sacs, land uses are very polarised, and it's very difficult to get around, particularly between these land uses, without walking to the sort of arterial road, for example. And of course what we aspire to do is build places like we see on the right, which are better connected, places where land uses are mixed up, and this type of pattern of development allows us to do things in a more efficient, compact way. So, I think if most design manuals started with a diagram like this, it would actually, get them set in the right direction. And I think when we're talking about garden towns and garden villages, actually what we're talking about is creating this sort of genuine pattern of development. Okay, so where do we start? So this is a map of Taunton in 1850 or thereabouts, and what I would say actually is this is a garden town. It's a place where land uses are mixed up. It's a place that probably governed itself. It looked after itself. If there was a hole in the road, someone would come and mend it. And it had a very strong relationship with the surrounding green space. So that's a good place to start. But of course things changed, and you may have seen some of these slides before, but in the 1960s this document called Traffic in Towns was published by Colin Buchanan, and it depicted an image of the country which was very car orientated, and the whole sort of premise for this book was really about dealing with car growth, segregating cars, and segregating cars away from people. And really ever since Traffic in Towns we've been dealing with things in the same way. So through the 80s and 90s, some of you in the room, including myself, I can remember this book when I first started working. So DB32 was the design guide for residential roads and footpaths, and this advocated a pattern of development which was based on cul-de-sacs. Eventually these cul-de-sacs had to join an arterial road, and if you did that you had done your job. Of course, if we hang everything off arterial roads, we end up with very big roads, which create all sorts of severance and that type of thing. So we've changed our tune a little bit since then. And that type of approach has led to all these sorts of situations you might see. It's to do with distribution of road space. So basically vehicles given a lot of road space, pedestrians marginalised to the edge. We see these very bland corridors which are all about road traffic and not about anything else, and all the signs and lines that go with that. Things changed, and Manual for Streets was issued just over 10 years ago now, and was a massive step forward in how we think about street design. So it's a national publication, national guidance on how to do streets. There is another document I want to talk about, which is the Irish sort of design manual for urban roads and streets, which was published about 5 years ago. Now, I don't really want to include this, but it's actually a very good piece of guidance. So some of the material I draw on today sort of comes from the Irish Manual for Streets because it's a good document. But of course it doesn't have any jurisdiction in this country, I should point out. But what we do know is the Department of Transport would like to produce a new manual for streets. About 5 years ago, they produced a manual for streets 2, which looked at sort of street principles on busier streets, but that was never really fully endorsed by central government. So what we're hoping is in the future, a new manual for streets 3 is prepared, which is fully endorsed by central government and really bridges that gap between residential streets and busier streets, a bit like the Irish manual for streets has done. Okay, so what is the background to garden towns? Well, as I've showed earlier, Taunton in my mind was a garden town. It was a compact place. This is Taunton in 1850 as per the previous plan. It had a sort of connected street network. It had a series of main streets which were lined with shops and jobs, and it had a very close relationship with green space. So it met a lot of those garden town criteria. And of course the other big point is that it was very compact. So I've zoomed down a bit because in a minute I'm going to zoom out to show the growth of Taunton. But actually that circle has a 1,000-metre radius. That equates to something like a 12-minute walk, which means every person in Taunton could walk to the centre of town in 10 minutes maximum, which is a very helpful thing. By the 50s, Taunton had grown quite significantly, and that black circle is the same circle as I showed you before. So now what we're seeing is expansion of the northern neighbourhoods, and of course with distance comes longer journey times. And what this starts to mean is that people can't really walk into the centre. They are reliant on other modes of transport. This plan also shows in orange the sort of main road network which was starting to emerge from Taunton as well. So, very much thinking about an A road network to serve the car. And then what we now see today is a much expanded Taunton. We of course see the M5 and a series of other big roads like Tone Way which have been built. And of course the proximity to some of these surrounding neighbourhoods is really quite significant. And I suppose the point I'm trying to make here is as Taunton has grown, it has reduced people's ability to walk to the centre, so we are reliant on other modes of transport, cycling, buses, and car use. And of course the challenge now is what happens next. These are the land allocations which Tim has showed you earlier, which are now supporting the garden town approach. So further peripheral growth, and really what this means is Taunton needs to consider a really good transport network which delivers sort of transport by a variety of modes to get people from these outlying areas in ways which are not just the private car. So investing in cycleways and in sort of public transport. I thought I'd have a quick look at some of the Garden City principles. So these are the 9 principles which the Town and Country Planning Association sort of advocate. There's some very good guidance around these on their website. And I suppose what I'm interested in is the transport and movement aspects of these principles. And of course, if you look right down at the bottom here, point number 9, we see something about transport. So integrated and accessible transport systems, walking, cycling, public transport, to be the most attractive forms of transport. So there it is, in last place, unfortunately. But actually, when you start looking at this in more detail, actually, my view is that transport and streets are actually more embedded in these principles. So the first one is all about land value capture for the benefit of the community. So what that's all about is saying to the landowner, you can't have all the sort of value from the land. Some of that needs to be put back in to the infrastructure. So for a street designer, that's potentially really good news. It means we can use some of that capital to do better streets. Points 2 and 3 are about leadership and community ownership. And again, this is really good actually for the street designer because it means that we can actually maintain the asset better than we currently do. You talk to anyone at county and maintenance will be one of their big issues at the moment. Point 5 is about sort of creating jobs near homes. So this, of course, is great in terms of movement terms. It creates sort of containment. People can live and work closer to home, which reduces the need to travel. So actually, a lot of these transport principles are embedded in this. Sort of Jane spoke about health. So garden villages, cities are all about creating healthy communities. If we create the right walking and cycling infrastructure, we can have massive health benefits. And then linking that with green infrastructure and creating walkable places. So actually there's an awful lot around transport and movement in these principles. So what I wanted to do now is just look at sort of some principles really for sort of highway design and highway thinking in placemaking. So I'm going to start by talking about the kind of big picture, street networks, and there are 7 principles I wanted to briefly touch on. There they are, and then I'm going to talk a bit about some of the more detailed design considerations. So the first principle really is about creating integrated street networks. And I've used some examples to sort of highlight some of these points really. So Sherford is a large, some new settlement near Plymouth. And one of the key things Sherford is trying to do is mix up land uses to ensure that many different land uses are happening within a sort of street-based sort of environment. And these type of principles are well embedded in Manual for Streets. There's that same old diagram again, actually, in a slightly different form. It's about creating integrated streets which are connected and trying to avoid this sort of cul-de-sac type pattern, which we used to do in the 80s and 90s. These principles are also form part of the Irish Manual for Streets. Some of you will probably recognise that diagram on the right. I think it probably comes from the Urban Design Compendium. But it's really about ensuring that different land uses are mixed in a compact way. And if we do that, it's easier to embed sustainable transport. Another example, this is down the road in Exeter, the Tithe Barn Link Road Phase 2, I would say is a good example of an integrated street. In this case, sort of Devon County have funded the delivery of the route. It's quite an interesting design. It's perhaps not the best photograph because the development hasn't quite caught up with it yet. But when complete, the link road sort of will be a stage for a lot of housing and importantly the local centre and in very close proximity to the science park. So what you've got is a whole heap of sort of interesting land uses in close proximity, and this street, if you like, providing kind of stage for all those things to happen. Principle 2, streets are places. So back to Sherford again, and I think this is something we don't do particularly well. We often think about places being the bits sort of embedded in the block and streets being the bit that moves people around. But I think sort of many developers, including this example here in Sherford, are now seeing the advantages of street-based urban design, driving their whole developments, driving values and that type of thing. And these ideas are very much embedded in lots of design guidance. So if we need, guidance, there's lots of places to go and find that really. Wanted to touch on some examples of design review. So I think sort of Tim alluded to Cole Orchard. This is a project which has been through the design review panel, and just some images of sort of what the panel saw and what happened to it on that journey really. So this was the original scheme which was reviewed, and actually we see schemes of lots of different qualities. This scheme I would say was a reasonably good quality when it came to the review panel. And of course I'm showing this because it was predominantly street based. It was a master plan which was premised on a series of streets, some of those pedestrian only, some of them providing for low speed traffic movement and access to car parks. And I think on that journey and the scheme that's now been approved, I think the scheme has changed a little bit. I think it's changed for the better, but actually the street is one of the really important ingredients to the success of that scheme. The third principle is movement and place. So some of you may be aware of this publication called Lincoln Place, and really what Lincoln Place says is that every street has a link status, i.e. that's how important it is in transport terms, and it also has a place status, so how important it is in place terms. So some of our major cities, you know, the capital London and the nation's second city Birmingham have both adopted this as their way of looking at their networks. Both cities have a network plan which is drawn using Lincoln Place. So just to explain sort of how this works, we can have this matrix here. This is the movement status. So this is a high order road. This is a lower order road. This is a high place status, for instance, a high street, and this is a low place status. And you can come up with different types of street within that. And really what that allows you to do is develop a network plan for how your place currently exists, and then also starting to look at how you want it to be in the future. So that it might involve some entirely new roads, and then it begs the question, what type of character or use do we want out of these roads? You know, are they going to be high streets, or are they just going to be single-purpose expressways, for example? So it's a very useful tool. Lincoln Place is entirely embedded in Manual for Streets. I'm afraid the diagram wasn't quite up to it, but the principle of Lincoln Place is in Manual for Streets. This has DFT backing, so I think we can all safely say that this is a robust method. It also forms part of the Irish Manual for Streets, and in fact this manual goes further and provides some really good guidance on what we mean by Manual for Streets and how that can be applied. It uses the categories of arterial, link and local streets, and it shows what that might mean for a kind of typical corridor, for example, and what we see is that the context changes quite often. And then it provides some guidance on how you can bring those two things together. This is a master plan which is currently being built down in Newquay. This is a Duchy master plan. I know Duchy have been mentioned earlier today. They have a lot of control on their development, but design quality is kind of one of their key drivers. And I'm showing this because this is an interesting master plan, because what this does is this unites, well, actually master plans around an existing busy road. So this is one of the key corridors into Newquay at the moment. This is a fairly busy road, and a lot of developers would have perhaps backed onto that. They would have seen that as a negative feature, but what this master plan does is it's transforming this road from fast moving rural distributor into a sort of urban avenue, if you like, with slower speeds, with development frontage, with crossings, with street trees, etc., etc. And although it's only part built, I'm pretty sure this is going to be a very successful project. Principle number 4 is around wayfinding. So Duchy again, I'm afraid. So this is one of the original diagrams of Poundbury and Dorchester. So the dark pink here is the kind of master plan, the main blocks, the main building blocks, if you like, of Poundbury, and showing the relationship with the rest of Dorchester, picking up on key land uses, etc., and key routes, to really show how the new place has a very logical fit with the existing place. Putting aside the architecture, this has got nothing to do with architecture or detailing. This is about the overall structure, the land use, and the kind of legibility of what's being created. We see all sorts of developments in the design review panel. This is an example from Swindon. Again, this was a fairly decent proposal which was put forward by, I think, Taylor Wimpey. The existing context, actually, though, was one of sort of fairly average 90s development with cul-de-sacs, sort of backing actually on to the edge of the settlement. So it was a fairly awkward situation of back fences looking out over this kind of quite nice countryside, but actually all this being quite visible from one of the main approach routes into Swindon. So the original master plan that we saw and reviewed was all about sort of trying to repair the edge, actually, and create a more logical termination to the settlement, and also trying to deal with some of these cul-de-sacs. So actually by sort of opening up some of these and creating routes through, I think what we've got at the end here is something which is providing, you know, a small-scale residential development, which is repairing the edge of the settlement and also improving the connections in that now you can actually walk from the north sort of down to the south. Principle number 5 is around permeable street grids. So, you know, that image of Taunton I showed earlier was a very permeable place, and lots of master plans seek to do this. Sorry, this is Poundbury again. So Poundbury's street structure and street pattern is very interesting and very permeable. So I would definitely be sort of signing up to this sort of level of permeability in any large-scale master plan. And there's lots of good guidance on this. The Manual for Streets and the Irish Manual for Streets both have an awful lot of good guidance about this. I'd actually say the Irish Manual for Streets probably does it better. It goes into a lot of detail about how you lay out street grids, which is actually quite a rare thing because I can't think of many other design guides which do that actually. We have very little guidance on the laying out of a street grid in this country, which is interesting because lots of other countries do. Principle number 6 is about managing vehicle permeability. So it's all well and good creating a very permeable place, but of course if we do that, there is the potential for rat running and for some of those streets to be used inappropriately. So there's lots of guidance and examples about how we do that. So this is Clonburris, which is what was originally termed an eco-district in South Dublin. This is very large-scale development, capable of taking 10,000 homes, serviced by trams, railway stations, umpteen bus routes, etc., etc. And one of the ways we can do that is we can start to limit sort of permeability into these developments. But you know, we need to do that with some caution. So this diagram sort of exists in Manual for Streets. This pattern of streets here is actually the phase 1 of Poundbury, which is a very permeable development. And what the Manual for Streets is saying is it's not just about taking a permeable cell and connecting it to an arterial road and doing that numerous times. What we actually need to do is create something that's more integrated. And there are some diagrams on the right there that show how that can be done. Then the Irish Manual for Streets also illustrates sort of how that can be done as well. And it has various techniques for dealing with that permeability and trying to manage traffic flow into that one. So this one at the bottom here is interesting. So this is filtered permeability. This is where we create a very permeable network, but then we actually sever it in various places to vehicle traffic. So it's very easy to walk or cycle around, but a bit more hard to drive around. And here's another design review example. So this one down in East Devon. This is actually very close to the Tithe Barn Link Road I showed you a minute ago. So the Tithe Barn Link Road is this one here. And the idea for this master plan is that different reserve matter applications will come forward. So what design reviewers enable us to do is to really try and coordinate some of those parcels of land. And the opportunity here was really to ensure that this parcel had a strong relationship with the parcel to the south. So through a process of design review, a very permeable network was created in terms of north-south links. Some of these are walking and cycling only, some of these are vehicle. And the idea is that the next reserve matter application would be coordinated with that to ensure that there's all these sort of lateral moves as well. This one has now been built, so this is a Barrett David Wilson scheme. It's now been built. It's worth going to look at. And principle number 7 is lastly, it's really about buses and bus rapid transit. So just touching back on this point about Taunton. Taunton has grown. We are reliant on the bus, as an alternative to the car. We need to do buses better. We need to do more bus lanes like this, and we need to give buses more assistance in town centres. Various master plans have sort of put the bus at the centre of the master plan. Sherford's interesting in that it sought to coordinate density and land use around the bus corridors. So this very colourful diagram here was showing densities. So if we take buses to areas of high density, we sort of maximise the viability of buses. There's some good experiences coming out of Bristol. Bristol has recently spent £100 million on the Metro bus, which, although there's been a few snags here or there, will be a very successful project. You invest in bus fleets, you invest heavily in bus infrastructure, whether that's bus lanes, busways, bus stops, the whole lot basically, and you create this near tram experience, which we would call BRT, so bus rapid transit. And this project's important because this is going to be extended to open up a lot of the growth around Bristol. So the joint core strategy, the joint special plan, in Bristol is talking about 105,000 homes in that sub-region, which is just phenomenal. 105,000 new homes in the planned period. So actually seriously delivering BRT is the only way really to make that work. But technologies are changing. So you would have heard about connected and autonomous vehicles. We've done a lot of work on this as a business, and really what that work has shown is that private autonomous vehicles are still decades away. They're not going to be functioning in mixed traffic for 30 or 40 years. But sort of public transport shuttles are far more viable to do quite quickly. So, for example, so this is a case study of Exeter, showing how St David's Station could be linked to the central area with these sort of public transport shuttles. These exist already. This is a French company called Nava. They have ongoing trials in Paris and Lyon. And the whole idea here is if these are done on sort of dedicated space, a bit like a bus lane, this type of technology could be delivered almost immediately. And these type of ideas are now starting to gain some traction. So I think the point I wanted to make is that technology is changing, and local plans, core strategies need to sort of change with that, because most policy documents I read do not talk about autonomous vehicles. Right, the second part is really around street design. So there's a few principles here. I'll try and rattle through these reasonably quickly. Principle 8 is about designing for slower speed. So putting the architecture of Poundbury aside, you either like it or you don't, the street design is very good. And Poundbury employs a range of street types to manage speed in different ways, and here are just some of them. So we need to be cleverer than just deploying traffic calming or sleeping policemen. We need to use built form, we need to use materials to manage speed. There's lots of guidance on this. The Irish Manual for Streets provides some really good guidance on street types, street classifications and speed and context. It talks about the design approach, how you look at context, so how you come up with the function of a street, what that means for speed, and therefore what that means for design response. So there's a really good guidance in there. So it's about designing for self-regulating streets. And there's a whole heap of ways that we can sort of reduce speed if we need to as well. The other issue, I suppose, is street width and frontage condition. So back to Newquay again. The master plan for Newquay plays with street frontage in a really interesting way. As you drive down, or when this is built, so when you drive down some of the central streets, the street environment will change as you go along it. For instance, what we've got here is we've got Causeway Bridge, we've got tight urban street, sort of opening up into more of a public space with car parking. So a whole series of interesting things happening along the same street. And there's lots of guidance on that in some Manual for Streets and the Irish Manual for Streets. I'll move on. Right, here's another example from a design review panel. I'm not going to tell you where this one is, unfortunately, because this was possibly the worst scheme we've ever seen come through the design review panel. And it kind of fails, really, I think, fundamentally because of their approach to streets. This is the site here. You can see that the site sits in a rather awkward context of different things. You've got more kind of historic development here. You've got probably post-war growth here, and then a load of sort of 80s and 90s stuff around, with then kind of more open spaces to the west there. So the original master plan that we saw, and this came to design review, looked like this. A blue blob, which was going to be a community centre, but actually no guidance on what that was going to be or its relationship with any of the streets. 3 bungalows on the front there as a sort of dramatic gateway to the site. And then this sort of weird sort of snaking street with these sort of full-on traffic calmed kind of corners and things, with things just seemingly sort of dotted around and really not working any way. So, as you'd imagine, this scheme had a fairly robust review, and, a letter was issued. They submitted this, which possibly is slightly better in that it provides for a more connected network. The cul-de-sacs have largely gone. There's perhaps a better relationship with buildings and the street, but the frontage still quite weak. And that was revised again. I'm not sure this ever got planning consent, but it just shows that we see schemes of differing qualities, and hopefully every time they come back they get slightly better. I think this one probably still needs to come back several more times. Principle 10 is around active streets. So I suppose there's a similar concept actually to streets of places. This is another good diagram actually. So this is in some manual for streets. This is 2 ways that Upton in Northampton could have come forward. So the plan on the left is the historic sort of land allocation diagram, probably from the 90s, I think. And of course, what we see on here is 2 lovely roundabouts, point 1 and point 2, connected with this sort of snaking spine road with a series of other large junctions on it. And then basically land use parcels seemingly hung off it in a random way, with sort of a local centre and a school thrown in the middle. So you can almost imagine the chief planner and the chief highway engineer sort of shaking hands on this plan, saying we've both done our job. You've got your land, I've got that nice highway to design and build. I think we all know that if that had been built, it wouldn't have been a particularly great place. Unfortunately, the scheme went through a master planning exercise, and this is what came out at the end of it. I mean, it hasn't quite been built like this, but it's not far off. And really what this is advocating is, instead of the loopy spine road, we have this mixed-use street with a series of events, public spaces, land uses sort of happening along route. So 2 ways of doing the same thing, delivering transport infrastructure and land use. We've seen proposals for the emerging Monkton Heathfield. I think there's a really good opportunity for Taunton, to really come up with some exemplar development. Need to think very carefully about how some of the existing streets are used, new streets, central streets. So I suppose the point is that streets are fundamentally important to the nature of these master plans. Principle 10 is around active streets. So if we are going to accept this point about Lincoln Place and we're designing new streets, we need to ensure that streets are activated. So frontage, potentially on-street parking, front doors, and potentially avoiding swathes of driveways. So if we do those things, we'll create more active streets, and there's lots of guidance on that. Being very careful about backs and fronts. So lots of development historically has been built like what you're seeing here, link roads which seemingly have miles of timber fencing. But actually, if you think through the master plan, the orientation of streets, buildings, you can actually design nearly all of that out to ensure that all streets are fronted, that we don't have this sort of back condition. Another example from design review. This is a scheme in Mid-Devon, dare I say it. The original scheme was advocating a small station car park. This is the scheme that came to design review. The design review panel immediately says, what sort of environment are you creating in this car park? Because the development looked in on itself. These are back gardens onto the car park. This is a railway line. So you can only imagine what sort of place that would have been at night. So through a process of design review, the scheme evolved, and what eventually came forward was some frontage on this side to provide some surveillance over the car park, and really just thinking about framing houses around streets. So instead of this kind of insular, inward-looking thing, which maybe had a poor relationship with the main road, it was creating a more natural condition with some frontage on the main road and frontage on some of the internal streets. The scheme has now got planning, and last time I saw, the land was up for sale, so in case you're interested. Principle 11 is really around signage, markings and furniture, so we're sort of delving into the detail here a little bit. Kensington High Street for me still stands out as an exemplar project. It's probably 20 years old now, at least 15 years old. So I know the guys that designed this, and it really changed the way we think about how we arrange our streets, and particularly the detail. So being a little bit obsessed about creating very linear lines, thinking about all the space. So every square metre needs to sort of earn its place, hence what was at the time a very controversial and new idea about putting bike parking on the central median. Sort of relaxing some of the signage sort of regulations. So at the time, this type of sign should have been illuminated. So they agreed relaxations. Street trees, great, and just a very tidy scheme. There's lots of good guidance on this in Manual for Streets. I mean, this is one area where Manual for Streets actually does go possibly a little bit overboard, actually, in terms of sort of decluttering strategies. You're talking about furniture zones, taking out guardrail, all these issues. Principle 12 is really about materials and planting. So there's loads of really good examples of really well-planted scheme. I mean, I keep on showing pictures of Ireland. I've sort of done a lot of work there, which is possibly why. So this is O'Connell Street in Dublin. So you know, a really good example of a scheme that has really good materials, really good planting. We can't do that everywhere, of course. So we do need to come up with a range of palettes from kind of high-end stuff like you do in the middle of Taunton Town Centre, to sort of more moderate stuff that you might do in the middle of Monkton Heathfield, to sort of utility stuff that you do on the kind of residential roads in Monkton Heathfield. Some more ideas about planting and materials. But it's not just about planting and materials. So Principle 13 is about pavements, sort of footways and crossings, really. So there's some good examples in Clapham Old Town, for example, about reducing carriageway space, just using tried and tested traffic engineering like a zebra crossing with a few trees to create a much better place. And also sometimes being brave with kind of modes. So what they've done in London a lot of is this what we call a Copenhagen entry treatment, which is basically about building the pavement across the side road and giving the pedestrian priority. And these are popping up all over London and work particularly well where you've got a very, very minor side road. So yeah, there's lots of good guidance on footways and crossings. I won't go through the detail of that. Okay, so Principle 14 is around informal streets. This type of idea is gathering some pace in the UK. This is a project in Poynton, Cheshire, and this is a very successful project actually, because it has entirely transformed a busy A road from what was 20,000 vehicles a day going through some pretty ugly traffic signals to this, which is a series of sort of informal roundels, creating slower speed environments, creating much better crossing opportunities, and ultimately the values in Poynton have gone through the roof. Everyone wants to move to Poynton because it's had £5 million spent on the town centre in a clever targeted way. So we would definitely sign up to this concept of informal streets. They need to be done well. You need to look very carefully at design guidance. You'd probably be aware there's been a bit of chat recently from the DFT about flush surfaces. So we have to be very careful with how we do flush surfaces. They're fine on quiet residential roads, but if we're going to do them in busier environments, we need to be a little bit careful, and we sort of tend to avoid flush surfaces on busier routes. So really what I'm showing here is there's lots of guidance and manual for streets for how we do that on different types of streets, so some of the quieter streets as well. Another design review example is this one from Plymouth. Now, this is an interesting project because before the scheme even got to the drawing board, there was a council deal done that at the site, which is this thing, this bit would be retained as open space. And the deal was done that that bit had to be the open space. So that was one of the constraints which the applicant had. And this just shows some steps that we went through in terms of seeking to improve the scheme. So it's as others have said, every time the scheme came to design review, it was about a step change in its quality. So the first scheme that came back actually, it was a funny response because they hadn't really sought to front the open space. There was some housing here, but the hedgerow was being retained. So not a particularly great hedgerow, not historic or anything. And through a process of steps, we came up with this scheme. So there's a better relationship between homes and open space. We worked very carefully with them on the street design and actually the detail of that. So exactly how much of the carriageway was going to be you could drive on. And this scheme actually has a series of flush surfaces. This has now been built as well. It's in Plimpton. It's another scheme that's worth going to look at. We also need to be very careful with carriageway width. So Principle 15, and we are nearly there, I should promise, is about carriageway width. So this is one of the more minor streets in Poynton, and this just shows how they've managed carriageway width in Poynton. So the clever use of central medians, these little tactile zones. So when cars drive on the tactile bit, they get a bit of a rumble. So they want to drive on the tarmac because it's smoother. So it just reduces the amount of width that they have and helps to manage speed. There's loads of guidance on width, but I suppose the main point of what I would want to say is that we should keep our streets as narrow as they need to be. We don't need to design wide streets if they don't need to be wide. And one of the reasons we should do that is that we need to be hardwiring, I think, sort of cycleways into many of our streets. So over the years, we've been doing cycling in different ways, whether it be cycle lanes or shared facilities. But what seems to be gaining what people want to do is these segregated cycleways. This is actually what most cyclists want, and this type of facility would suit cycling of all ages, from kids to older people as well. So we're seeing these pop up all over London. You would have heard of the super cycle highways. We're seeing them in lots of other places now. I know that some are being built in Exeter, for example. So I think this type of segregated cycleway built at the side of the carriageway is something we need to do a lot more of. And towns like Taunton, for example, could deliver really quite comprehensive networks of this type of thing. Principle 16 is junction design. Just to say, the manual for streets advocates a lot of flexibility actually when it comes to junction form, and almost too much if anything. But here's a sort of diagram showing you what's in there. You can basically have any junction you want in any shape or form, it looks like. The key thing to remember, though, is manual for streets really only has a remit of residential development. It's not saying we can do this on kind of bigger streets. But I think some of these principles we can. So if we mix up some of these with conventional traffic engineering, we can do more interesting forms of junction. Principle 17 is really looking at visibility and alignment. So very briefly, one of the big things the Manual for Streets did is it sort of broke this idea that we need massive visibility on highways, because actually what it said, it did a lot of research into forward visibility and width of road, and it said if you can see a long way and if the road is very wide, people drive very quickly. So therefore what it did is it turned a lot of highway thinking on its head, and it said, okay, well if we reduce the forward visibility, then it means the speed will reduce. So now we're in a situation where we have significantly reduced forward visibility requirements, which is very helpful, because it allows us to design places in a tighter way, and it helps us manage speed. So although a little bit of a dull graph, it's actually fundamentally important to the traffic engineer. There's other things we can do to manage speed as well by changing the alignment of roads and employing entry treatments. Of course, that's not always the end of the story. We have to get these things adopted by the highway authority, whoever that highway authority might be. This is actually a real example of a scheme which Phil Jones Associates put together with, I think it was probably Bloor Homes or someone like that. Fairly sensible master plan with a kind of grid of streets with some sort of place markers, if you like, on junctions. But unfortunately, when we took it to the county, and this is not a county in the southwest, I should point out, they said, well, that's not in accordance with our county design guide. You need to follow these principles. And when we followed their principles, this is what popped out. So we need to ensure that all levels of the public sector are kind of working together. I do think, a lot of county design guides could do with a bit of, an overhaul. For instance, I know the Devon one, and I don't want to name and shame, is dated in the 90s. They do accept Manual for Streets, but, with a bit of funding, I think they could write a really good new design guide. And then just lastly, parking. So parking is fundamentally important to new development, to driving existing town centres, for example. So really, so what Manual for Streets says is do parking in a very mixed up way. We shouldn't just have a single solution. We should think about on-street parking as a solution. We need to think about some allocated parking, perhaps in driveways, perhaps in courtyards. So I think the main message is we need to mix it up and not just employ a single approach in a place. And there's lots of guidance about that, about how you can arrange parking without going into the detail of that. That's another example here, and this one's all to do with this sort of old issue that you can't allocate parking sort of in the public highway. So one of the challenges for doing on-street parking quite often is that there's a policy that says the parking has to be allocated. And of course, you can't allocate in the public highway. So this is just an example that shows how we achieved parking, which appears to be on the street in a fairly tidy way, but it's actually done just at the back of the sort of highway, so that spaces can be allocated, but it's meant that they're not in drives. They are part of the street. So there's a little trick there. Great, so the last slide you might be glad to hear. So some conclusions. So I'm a big fan of sort of understanding context. So anything that we design, whether it's in a town centre or in a new development, it's really important that we understand, how the place has evolved to be the way it is. I would always say research design guidance. There's lots of good guidance out there, and it's sometimes important to challenge guidance as well. All places should have, in my view, a street network strategy, and not many places do. And what I mean by a street network strategy is looking at all their streets, maybe employing a link and place approach, looking at how the streets are used, looking at where new roads need to be built, for example, and looking at how existing roads may want to change as a result of new roads being built. So, street network strategy is fundamentally important. We need to be ensuring that we've got modal balance, and a lot of the stuff we build at the moment is still very car orientated. We need to do actually what they do on the continent and employ an interdisciplinary approach to street design. You would have all driven through any random French town and thought this is a very nice bit of streetscape in the centre of town, it's because every scheme they do has a multidisciplinary team of people looking at it. It will have the town architect, the town landscape person, the town highway person. So a very different approach to how we do it here. We also need to think about long-term care. So this is kind of paramount to any county council with kind of funding issues. So we need to think about how we look after streets, and maybe garden towns will help. And also new approaches to funding. So it was really interesting to hear kind of stuff coming out of HIF funds and and the like, and city deals are being done in the southwest as well. So we need to sort of do funding in a different way. So thank you very much.